Now that I have the left to right panels installed into the valley, I'll transfer over to this section. First of all, what I need to do is find the point that this panel rib crosses into the valley. So I'll take my square blade, follow it down, place a mark. What I want to have happen are the panel ribs to line up. So I have my mark here, and at that point, I can measure out 16 inches, as I've got a 16-inch panel, place a mark, and transfer a line down to the eave. Once I have my mark on my eave, I'll measure the panel width, which is 16 inches, place the mark, and at the hip, measure 8 inches to the hip, I'm sorry, 8.5. So across the hip the other side, measure 8.5, and then go back to the full width panel. 16 and 16. That's going to leave me a 2.5-inch panel. So that's what I'm going to make. What I don't want to start with a full width panel, because as I move around, I'll get into the valley and my valley panels won't line up. It's always important to try to line up valley and hip panels whenever possible. And that can always be done if the roofs are on the same pitch. If I'm dealing with two roof areas that are not the same pitch, the panels will not line up. However, if I'm dealing with, in this case, a 412 and a 412, I can definitely line those panels up, so that's what I'm going to do. Line up the valley, transfer to the hip, line up the hip, and then I'll deal with the panel width that I have at the rake wall. I've cut my panel for the rake edge. I've turned up my 1 inch for the rake wall. Now I'll install this first panel. Place it flush to the eave, right up against the wall. Once I get it in place, I'll put one screw in the top to hold the panel. And now I can complete the process securing the panel to the substrate with screws. I always want to put my first screw at the lowest possible point. If I go into this slot, I'll be through the drip edge. So I'll come up to the next slot, place a screw in the center of the slot. Once I have the first panel installed, the next step before attaching the second panel is to have tube sealant to the male edge. I'll apply tube sealant on the top of the rib, male rib, from a point at the eave to a point 6 inches up. I'll also apply 2 strips of tube sealant up the side of the male rib on each side of the double bead butyl tape. Again, this is to prevent ice dams and any water that can penetrate the end of the panel from stopping at that point. So we've got the double bead butyl tape and the tube sealant in line. I've installed the panels on this side from right to left. As I come to the hip, I turn a 1 inch tab up directly on the hip. Coming over to this side, again, I'm going to keep the same measurement that I had on the other side of the hip so that I can continue to line up my panel ribs. So I'll measure out 8 3/4, 8 3/4, and then I can just simply measure up 9 1/2. So I'll cut a triangle 9 1/2 by 8 3/4, turn up 1 inch, and then I can install the panel. Panel's cut, tab turned up, ready to be installed. Again, my ribs will line up as I go right up the hip. And I'll continue this process through, up the hip and across the valley till I finish off at the top of the valley. When securing a panel, once it's installed, fabricated up on the eave, I'm going to put a screw on the top edge of the panel to hold it in place. The best place to put the screw is on the female side where you just locked it over, right up as high as you can. The screw is going to be hidden by the Z closures on the hip. So every panel as I put it in, I'll install one screw over right next to the female rib, and that'll hold the panel in place.